Chapter 7. You must sacrifice him. Warily Cadj and his 100 frightful followers, armed with their bludgeons and knives, crept stealthily down the face of the barrier into the valley below, upon the trail of the white man and his black companions. They made no haste, for they had noted from the summit of Opar's outer wall that the party they were pursuing moved very slowly, though why they did not know, for they had been at too great a distance to see the burden that each of the blacks carried. Nor was it Cadje's desire to overtake his quarry by daylight, his plans contemplating a stealthy night attack, the suddenness of which, together with the great number of his followers, might easily confuse and overwhelm a sleeping camp. The spoor they followed was well marked. There could be no mistaking it, and they moved slowly down the now gentle declivity toward the bottom of the valley. It was close to noon that they were brought to a sudden halt by the discovery of a thorn boma recently constructed in a small clearing just ahead of them. From the center of the boma arose the thin smoke of a dying fire. Here, then, was the camp of the ape-man. Cadje drew his followers into the concealment of the thick bushes that bordered the trail, and from there he sent ahead a single man to reconnoiter. It was but a few moments later that the latter returned to say that the camp was deserted, and once again Cadje moved forward with his men. Entering the boma, they examined it in an effort to estimate the size of the party that accompanied Tarzan. As they were thus occupied, Cadje saw something lying half concealed by bushes at the far end of the boma. Very warily he approached it, for there was that about it which not only aroused his curiosity but prompted him to caution, for it resembled indistinctly the figure of a man lying huddled upon the ground. With ready bludgeons, a dozen of them approached the thing that had aroused Cadje's curiosity, and when they had come close to it, they saw lying before them the lifeless figure of Tarzan of the apes. "The flaming god has reached forth to avenge his desecrated altar," cried the high priest, his eyes glowing with the maniacal fires of fanaticism. But another priest, more practical perhaps, or at least more cautious, kneeled beside the figure of the ape-man and placed his ear against the latter's heart. "He is not dead," he whispered, "perhaps he only sleeps." "Seize him then," quickly cried Cadje, and an instant later Tarzan's body was covered by the hairy forms of as many of the frightful men as could pile upon him. He offered no resistance, he did not even open his eyes, and presently his arms were securely bound behind him. "Drag him forth, where the eye of the flaming god may rest upon him," cried Cadje. They dragged Tarzan out into the center of the boma, into the full light of the sun, and Cadje, the high priest, drawing his knife from his loincloth, raised it above his head and stood over the prostrate form of his intended victim. Cadje's followers formed a rough circle about the ape-man, and some of them pressed close behind their leader. They appeared uneasy, looking alternately at Tarzan and their high priest, and then casting furtive glances at the sun, riding high in a cloud-mottled sky. But whatever the thoughts that troubled their half-savage brains, there was only one who dared voice his, and he was the same priest who, upon the preceding day, had questioned Cadje's proposal to slay the ape-man. "Cadje," he said now, "who are you to offer up a sacrifice to the flaming god? It is the privilege alone of La, our high priestess and our queen, and indeed will she be angry when she learns what you have done." "Silence, Duth," cried Cadje. "Cadje am the high priest of Opar. I, Cadje, am the mate of La, the queen. My word, too, is law in Opar. And you would remain a priest, and you would remain alive. Keep silence." "Your word is not law," replied Booth angrily, "and if you anger La, the high priestess, or if you anger the flaming god, you may be punished as another. If you make this sacrifice, both will be angry." "Enough," cried Cadje, "the flaming god has spoken to me and has demanded that I offer up as sacrifice this defiler of his temple." He knelt beside the ape-man and touched his breast above the heart with the point of his sharp blade, and then he raised the weapon high above him, preparatory to the fatal plunge into the living heart. At that instant a cloud passed before the face of the sun, and a shadow rested upon them. A murmur rose from the surrounding priests. "Look," cried Duth, "the flaming god is angry. He has hidden his face from the people of Opar." Cadje paused. He cast a half-defiant, half-frightened look at the cloud obscuring the face or the sun. Then he rose slowly to his feet, and extending his arms upward toward the hidden god of day, he remained for a moment silent in apparently attentive and listening attitude. Then, suddenly, he turned upon his followers. "Priests of Opar," he cried, "the flaming god has spoken to his high priest Cadje. He is not angered. He but wishes to speak to me alone, and he directs that you go away into the jungle and wait until he has come and spoken to Cadje, after which I shall call you to return. Go." For the most part, they seemed to accept the word of Kadje as law, but Duth and a few others, doubtless prompted by a certain skepticism, hesitated. "Begone," commanded Kadje, and so powerful is the habit of obedience that the doubters finally turned away and melted into the jungle with the others. A crafty smile lighted the cruel face of the high priest as the last of them disappeared from sight, and then he once again turned his attention to the ape-man. That, deep within his breast, however, lurked an inherent fear of his deity, was evidenced by the fact that he turned questioning glances toward the sky. He had determined to slay the ape-man while Duth and the others were absent, yet the fear of his god restrained his hand until the light of his deity should shine forth upon him once more and assure him that the thing he contemplated might meet with favor. It was a large cloud that overcast the sun, and while Kadje waited, his nervousness increased. 6 times he raised his knife for the fatal blow, yet in each instance his superstition prevented the consummation of the act. 5, 10, 15 minutes passed, and still the sun remained obscured. But now at last Kadje could see that it was nearing the edge of the cloud, and once again he took his position, kneeling beside the ape-man with his blade ready for the moment that the sunlight should flood again, for the last time, the living Tarzan. He saw it sweeping slowly across the boma toward him, and as it came a look of demoniacal hatred shone in his close-set, wicked eyes. Another instant, and the flaming god would have set the seal of his approval upon the sacrifice. Kadje trembled in anticipation. He raised the knife a trifle higher, his muscles tensed for the downward plunge, and then the silence of the jungle was broken by a woman's voice, raised almost to a scream. Kadje came the single word, but with all the suddenness and all the surprising effect of lightning from a clear sky. His knife still poised on high, the high priest turned in the direction of the interruption to see at the clearing's edge the figure of Lele, the high priestess, and behind her Duth and a score of the lesser priests. "What means this?" Kadje demanded Lele, angrily, approaching rapidly toward him across the clearing. Sullenly the high priest rose. "The flaming god demanded the life of this unbeliever," he cried. "Speaker of lies," retorted Lele. "The flaming god communicates with men through the lips of his high priestess only. Too often already have you attempted to thwart the will of your queen. Know then, Kadje, that the power of life and death which your queen holds is as potent over you as another, during the long ages that Opar has endured. Our legends tell us that more than one high priest has been offered upon the altar to the flaming god, and it is not unlikely that yet another may go the way of the presumptuous. Curb therefore your vanity and your lust for power, lest they prove your undoing." Kadje sheathed his knife and turned sullenly away, casting a venomous look at Duth, to whom he evidently attributed his undoing. That he was temporarily abashed by the presence of his queen was evident, but to those who knew Kadje there was little doubt that he still harbored his intention to dispatch the ape-man, and if the opportunity ever presented itself that he would do so. For Kadje had a strong following among the people and priests of Opar. There were many who doubted that Lai would ever dare to incur the displeasure and anger of so important a portion of her followers as to cause the death or degradation of their high priest, who occupied his office by virtue of laws and customs so old that their origin had been long lost in antiquity. For years she had found first one excuse and then another to delay the ceremonies that would unite her in marriage to the high priest. She had further aroused the antagonism of her people by palpable proofs of her infatuation for the ape-man, and even though at last she had been compelled to mate with Kadje, she had made no effort whatsoever to conceal her hatred and loathing for the man. How much further she could go with impunity was a question that often troubled those whose position in Opar depended upon her favor, and knowing all these conditions as he did, it was not strange that Kadje should entertain treasonable thoughts toward his queen. Leagued with him in his treachery was Owa, a priestess who aspired to the power and offices of La. If Lay could be done away with, then Kadje had the influence to see that Owa became high priestess. He also had Owa's promise to mate with him and permit him to rule as king, but as yet both were bound by the superstitious fear of their flaming deity, and because of this fact was the life of La temporarily made safe. It required, however, but the slightest spark to ignite the flames of treason that were smoldering about her. So far she was well within her rights in forbidding the sacrifice of Tarzan by the high priest, but her fate, her very life, perhaps depended upon her future treatment of the prisoner. Should she spare him, should she evidence in any way a return of the great love she had once almost publicly avowed for him, it was likely that her doom would be sealed. It was even questionable whether or not she might with impunity spare his life, and set him at liberty. Kadjay and the others watched her closely now as she crossed to the side of Tarzan. Standing there silently for several moments, she looked down upon him. "He is already dead?" she asked. "He was not dead when Kadjay sent us away," volunteered Duth. "If he is dead now, it is because Kadjay killed him while we were away." "I did not kill him," said Kadjay. "That remains as our queen has told you for her to do. The eye of the flaming god looks down upon you, high priestess of Opar. The knife is at your hip, the sacrifice lies before you." Elay ignored the man's words and turned toward Duth. "If he still lives," she said, "construct a litter and bear him back to Opar." Thus once more came Tarzan of the Apes into the ancient colonial city of the Atlanteans. The effects of the narcotic that Krasky had administered to him did not wear off for many hours. It was night when he opened his eyes, and for a moment he was bewildered by the darkness and the silence that surrounded him. All that he could scent at first was that he lay upon a pile of furs, and that he was uninjured, for he felt no pain. Slowly there broke through the fog of his drugged brain recollection of the last moment before unconsciousness had overcome him, and presently he realized the trick that had been played upon him. For how long he had been unconscious and where he then was he could not imagine. Slowly he arose to his feet, finding that except for a slight dizziness he was quite himself. Cautiously he felt around in the darkness, moving with care, hand outstretched, and always feeling carefully with his feet for a secure footing. Almost immediately a stone wall stopped his progress, and this he followed around 4 sides of what he soon realized was a small room in which there were but 2 openings, a door upon each of the opposite sides. Only his senses of touch and smell were of value to him here. These told him only at first that he was imprisoned in a subterranean chamber, but as the effects of the narcotic diminished, the keenness of the latter returned. And with its return there was borne in upon Tarzan's brain an insistent impression of familiarity in certain fragrant odors that impinged upon his olfactory organs, a haunting suggestion that he had known them before under similar circumstances. Presently from above, through earth and masonry, came the shadow of an uncanny scream. Just the faintest suggestion of it reached the keen ears of the ape-man, but it was sufficient to flood his mind with vivid recollections, and by association of ideas, to fix the identity of the familiar odors about him. He knew at last that he was in the dark pit beneath Opar. Above him, in her chamber in the temple, Ella, the high priestess, tossed upon a sleepless couch. She knew all too well the temper of her people and the treachery of the high priest Kadjay. She knew the religious fanaticism which prompted the oft-time maniacal actions of her bestial and ignorant followers, and she guessed truly that Kadjay would inflame them against her, should she fail this time in sacrificing the ape-man to the flaming god. And it was the effort to find an escape from her dilemma that left her sleepless, for it was not in the heart of Lai to sacrifice Tarzan of the Apes, high priestess of a horrid cult, though she was, and queen of a race of half-beasts. Yet she was a woman too, a woman who had loved but once and given that love to the godlike ape-man who was again within her power. Twice before had he escaped her sacrificial knife. In the final instance, love had at last triumphed over jealousy and fanaticism, and La, the woman, had realized that never again could she place in jeopardy the life of the man she loved, however hopeless she knew that love to be. Tonight she was faced with a problem that she felt almost beyond her powers of solution. The fact that she was mated with Kadjay removed the last vestige of hope that she had ever had of becoming the wife of the ape-man. Yet she was no less determined to save Tarzan if it were possible. Twice had he saved her life, once from a mad priest, and once from Tantor and Must. Then, too, she had given her word that when Tarzan came again to Opar he came in friendship, and would be received in friendship. But the influence of Kadjay was great, and she knew that that influence had been directed unremittingly against the ape-man. She had seen it in the attitude of her followers from the very moment that they had placed Tarzan upon a litter to bear him back to Opar. She had seen it in the evil glances that had been cast at her. Sooner or later they would dare denounce her. All that they needed was some slight new excuse that, she knew, they eagerly awaited in her forthcoming attitude toward Tarzan. It was well after midnight when there came to her one of the priestesses who remained always upon guard outside her chamber door. "Duth would speak with you," whispered the handmaiden. "It is late," replied Lai, "and men are not permitted in this part of the temple. How came he here and why?" "He says that he comes in the service of La, who is in great danger," replied the girl. "Fetch him here then," said La, "and as you value your life, see that you tell no one." "I shall be as voiceless as the stones of the altar," replied the girl, as she turned and left the chamber. A moment later she returned, bringing Duth, who halted a few feet from the high priestess and saluted her. La signaled to the girl who had brought him to depart, and then she turned questioningly to the man. "Speak, Duth," she commanded. "We all know," he said, "of Lei's love for the strange ape-man, and it is not for me, a lesser priest, to question the thoughts or acts of my high priestess. It is only for me to serve, as those would do better to serve who now plot against you." "What do you mean, Duth, who plots against me?" "Even at this minute are Kajay and Oa and several of the priests and priestesses carrying out a plan for your undoing. They are setting spies to watch you, knowing that you would liberate the ape-man. Because there will come to you one who will tell you that to permit him to escape will be the easiest solution of your problem. This one will be sent by Kajay. And then those who watch you will report to the people and to the priests that they have seen you lead the sacrifice to liberty. But even that will avail you nothing, for Kajay and Oa and the others have placed upon the trail from Opar many men in hiding, who will fall upon the ape-man and slay him before the flaming god has descended twice into the western forest. In but one way only may you save yourself, Lei of Opar." "And what is that way?" she asked. "You must, with your own hands, upon the altar of our temple, sacrifice the ape-man to the flaming god." Chapter 8. Mystery of the Past. Lei had breakfasted the following morning and had sent Duth with food for Tarzan when there came to her a young priestess, who was the sister of Oa. Even before the girl had spoken, La knew that she was an emissary from Kajay, and that the treachery of which Duth had warned her was already underway. But the girl was ill at ease and quite evidently frightened, for she was young and held in high revere the queen whom she had good reason to know was all-powerful, and who might even inflict death upon her if she so wished. Lei, who had already determined upon a plan of action that she knew would be most embarrassing to Kajay and his conspirators, waited in silence for the girl to speak. But it was some time before the girl could muster up her courage or find a proper opening. Instead, she spoke of many things that had no bearing whatsoever upon her subject, and Lei, the high priestess, was amused at her discomfiture. "It is not often," said Lei, "that the sister of Oa comes to the apartments of her queen unless she is bidden. I am glad to see that she at last realizes the service that she owes to the high priestess of the flaming god." "I come," said the girl, at last, speaking almost as one who has learned a part, "to tell you that I have overheard that which may be of interest to you, and which I am sure that you will be glad to hear." "Yes," interrogated Lei, raising her arched eyebrows. "I overheard Kajay speaking with the lesser priests," the girl continued, "and I distinctly heard him say that he would be glad if the ape-man escaped, as that would relieve you, and Kajay as well, of much embarrassment. I thought that Lei, the queen, would be glad to know this, for it is known by all of us that Lei has promised friendship to the ape-man, and therefore does not wish to sacrifice him upon the altar of the flaming god." "My duty is plain to me," replied La, in a haughty voice, "and I do not need Kajay nor any handmaiden to interpret it to me. I also know the prerogatives of a high priestess, and that the right of sacrifice is one of them. For this reason I prevented Kajay from sacrificing the stranger. No other hand than mine may offer his heart's blood to the flaming god, and upon the third day he shall die beneath my knife upon the altar of our temple." The effect of these words upon the girl were precisely what Lei had anticipated. She saw disappointment and chagrin written upon the face of Kajay's messenger, who now had no answer, for her instructions had not foreseen this attitude upon the part of Lei. Presently the girl found some lame pretext upon which to withdraw, and when she had left the presence of the high priestess, Lei could scarcely restrain a smile. She had no intention of sacrificing Tarzan, but this of course the sister of Oa did not know. So she returned to Kajay and repeated as nearly as she could recall it, all that Lei had said to her. The high priest was much chagrined, for his plan had been now not so much to encompass the destruction of Tarzan as to lead Lei into the commission of an act that would bring upon her the wrath of the priests and people of Opar, who, properly instigated, would demand her life in expiation. Oa, who was present when her sister returned, bit her lips, for great was her disappointment. Never before had she seen so close at hand the longed-for possibility of becoming high priestess. For several minutes she paced to and fro in deep thought, and then, suddenly she halted before Kajay. "Allah loves this ape-man," she said, "and even though she may sacrifice him, it is only because of fear of her people. She loves him, still loves him better, Kajay, than she has ever loved you. The ape-man knows it and trusts her, and because he knows it there is a way. Listen, Kajay. And to Owa, we will send one to the ape-man who shall tell him that she comes from Lay, and that Lay has instructed her to lead him out of Opar and set him free. This one shall lead him into our ambush, and when he is killed we shall go, many of us before Lay, and accuse her of treachery. The one who led the ape-man from Opar shall say that La ordered her to do it, and the priests and the people will be very angry, and then you shall demand the life of Lay. It will be very easy, and we shall be rid of both of them. Good, exclaimed Kajay. We shall do this thing at dawn upon the morrow, and before the flaming god goes to his rest at night, he shall look upon a new high priestess in Opar. That night Tarzan was aroused from his sleep by a sound at one of the doors of his prison cell. He heard the bolt slipped back, and the door creak slowly open upon its ancient hinges. In the inky darkness he could discern no presence, but he heard the stealthy movement of sandaled feet upon the concrete floor, and then, out of the darkness, his name was whispered in a woman's voice. I am here, he replied. Who are you, and what do you want of Tarzan of the Apes? Your life is in danger, replied the voice. Come, follow me. Who sent you? Demanded the ape-man, his sensitive nostrils searching for a clue to the identity of the nocturnal visitor, but so heavily was the air laden with the pungent odor of some heavy perfume with which the body of the woman seemed to have been anointed, that there was no distinguishing clue by which he might judge as to whether she was one of the priestesses he had known upon the occasion of his former visits to Opar, or an entire stranger to him. La sent me, she said, to lead you from the pits of Opar to the freedom of the outside world beyond the city's walls. Groping in the darkness, she finally found him. Here are your weapons, she said, handing them to him, and then she took his hand, turned and led him from the dungeon, through a long, winding and equally black corridor, down flights of age-old concrete steps, through passages and corridors, opening and closing door after door that creaked and groaned upon rusty hinges. How far they traveled thus, and in what direction, Tarzan could not guess. He had gleaned enough from Duth, when the latter brought him his food, to believe that in LA he had a friend who would aid him, for Duth had told him that she had saved him from Kajay when the latter had discovered him unconscious in the deserted boma of the Europeans who had drugged and left him. And so the woman having said that she came from LA, Tarzan followed her willingly. He could not but recall Jane's prophecy of the evils that he might expect to befall him should he persist in undertaking this third trip to Opar, and he wondered if, after all, his wife was right, that he should never again escape from the toils of the fanatical priests of the flaming god. He had not, of course, expected to enter Opar, but there seemed to hang over the accursed city a guardian demon that threatened the life of whosoever dared approach the forbidden spot or wrest from the forgotten treasure vaults a portion of their great hoard. For more than an hour his guide led him through the Stygian darkness of underground passages, until ascending a flight of steps they emerged into the center of a clump of bushes, through which the pale light of the moon was barely discernible. The fresh air, however, told him that they had reached the surface of the ground, and now the woman, who had not spoken a word since she had led him from his cell, continued on in silence, following a devious trail that wound hither and thither in an erratic fashion through a heavy forest choked with undergrowth, and always upward. From the location of the stars and moon, and from the upward trend of the trail, Tarzan knew that he was being led into the mountains that lie behind Opar, a place he had never thought of visiting, since the country appeared rough and uninviting, and not likely to harbor game such as Tarzan cared most to hunt. He was already surprised by the nature of the vegetation, for he had thought the hills barren except for stunted trees and scraggy bush. As they continued upon their way, climbing ever upward, the moon rose higher in the heavens, until its soft light revealed more clearly to the keen eyes of the ape-man the topography of the country they were traversing, and then it was that he saw they were ascending a narrow, thickly wooded gorge. And he understood why the heavy vegetation had been invisible from the plain before Opar. Himself naturally uncommunicative, the woman's silence made no particular impression upon Tarzan. Had he had anything to say, he should have said it, and likewise he assumed that there was no necessity for her speaking, unless there was some good reason for speaking, for those who travel far and fast have no breath to waste upon conversation. The eastern stars were fading at the first hint of coming dawn when the two scrambled up a precipitous bank that formed the upper end of the ravine, and came out upon comparatively level ground. As they advanced, the sky lightened, and presently the woman halted at the edge of a declivity, and as the day broke, Tarzan saw below him a wooded basin in the heart of the mountain, and showing through the trees at what appeared to be some 2 or 3 miles distant. the outlines of a building that glistened and sparkled and scintillated in the light of the new sun. Then he turned and looked at his companion, and surprise and consternation were writ upon his face, for standing before him was Lay, the high priestess of Opar. "You," he exclaimed, "now indeed will Kadjay have the excuse that Duth said he sought to put you out of the way." "He will never have the opportunity to put me out of the way," replied Lay, "for I shall never return to Opar." "Never return to Opar," he exclaimed. "Then where are you going? Where can you go?" "I am going with you," she replied. "I do not ask that you love me. I only ask that you take me away from Opar and from the enemies who would slay me. There was no other way. Manu the monkey overheard them plotting, and he came to me and told me all that they would do, whether I saved you or sacrificed you. It had all been the same with me. They were determined to do away with me, that O might be high priestess and Kadjay king of Opar. But I should not have sacrificed you, Tarzan, under any circumstances, and this then seemed the only way in which we might both be saved. We could not go to the north or the west across the plain of Opar, for there Kadjay has placed warriors in ambush to waylay you, and though you be Tarzan and a mighty fighter, they would overwhelm you by their very numbers and slay you." "But where are you leading me?" asked Tarzan. "I have chosen the lesser of two evils. In this direction lies an unknown country, filled for us Oparians with legends of grim monsters and strange people. Never has an Oparian ventured here and returned again to Opar. But if there lives in all the world a creature who could win through this unknown valley, it be you, Tarzan of the apes. But if you know nothing of this country, or its inhabitants," demanded Tarzan, "how is it that you so well know the trail that leads to it?" "We well know the trail to the summit, but that is as far as I have ever been before. The great apes and the lions use this trail when they come down into Opar. The lions, of course, cannot tell us where it leads, and the great apes will not, for usually we are at war with them. Along this trail they come down into Opar to steal our people, and upon this trail we await to capture them, for often we offer a great ape in sacrifice to the flaming god, or rather that was our former custom, but for many years they have been too wary for us. The toll being upon the other side, though we do not know for what purpose they steal our people, unless it be that they eat them. They are a very powerful race, standing higher than Bolgani the gorilla, and infinitely more cunning, for as there is ape blood in our veins, so is there human blood in the veins of these great apes that dwell in the valley above Opar. Why is it, Lay, that we must pass through this valley in order to escape from Opar? There must be some other way." "There is no other way, Tarzan of the apes," she replied. "The avenues across the valley are guarded by Kadjay's people. Our only chance of escape lies in this direction. And I have brought you along the only trail that pierces the precipitous cliffs that guard Opar upon the south. Across or around this valley we must go in an attempt to find an avenue across the mountain and down upon the other side." The ape-man stood gazing down into the wooded basin below them, his mind occupied with the problems of the moment. Had he been alone, he would not have come this way, for he was sufficiently confident of his own prowess to believe that he might easily have crossed the valley of Opar in comparative safety, regardless of Kadjay's plans to the contrary. But he was not alone. He had now to think of L.A., and he realized that in her efforts to save him, she had placed him under a moral obligation which he might not disregard. To skirt the basin, keeping as far as possible from the building which he could see in the distance, seemed the wisest course to pursue, since of course his sole purpose was to find a way across the mountain and out of this inhospitable country. But the glimpses he caught of the edifice, half concealed as it was amid the foliage of great trees, piqued his curiosity to such an extent that he felt an almost irresistible urge to investigate. He did not believe that the basin was inhabited by other than wild beasts, and he attributed the building which he saw to the handiwork of an extinct or departed people, either contemporaneous with the ancient Atlanteans who had built Opar, or perhaps built by the original Oparians themselves, but now forgotten by their descendants. The glimpses which he caught of the building suggested such size and magnificence as might belong to a palace. The ape-man knew no fear, though he possessed to a reasonable extent that caution which is inherent in all wild beasts. He would not have hesitated to pit his cunning and his prowess against the lower orders, however ferocious they might be, for, unlike man, they could not band together to his undoing. But should men elect to hunt him in numbers, he knew that a real danger would confront him, and that, in the face of their combined strength and intelligence, his own might not avail him. There was little likelihood, however, he reasoned, that the basin was inhabited by human beings. Doubtless closer investigation of the building he saw would reveal that it was but a deserted ruin, and that the most formidable foes he would encounter would be the great apes and the lions. Of neither of these had he any fear. With the former, it was even reasonable to imagine that he might establish amicable relations. Believing as he did that he must look for egress from the basin upon its opposite side, it was only natural that he should wish to choose the most direct route across the basin. Therefore his inclinations to explore the valley were seconded by considerations of speed and expediency. "Come," he said to Elay, and started down the declivity which led into the basin in the direction of the building ahead of them. "You are not going that way," she cried in astonishment. "Why not?" he said. "It is the shortest way across the valley, and insofar as I can judge, our trail over the mountains is more likely to lie in that direction than elsewhere." "But I am afraid," she said. "The flaming god alone knows what hideous dangers lurk in the depths of that forest below us." "Only Numa and the Mangani," he said. "Of these we need have no fear." "You fear nothing," she said, "but I am only a woman." "We can die but once," replied Tarzan, "and that once we must die. To be always fearing then would not avert it, and would make life miserable. We shall go the short way then, and perhaps we shall see enough to make the risk well worth while." They followed a well-worn trail downward among the brush, the trees increasing in both size and number as they approached the floor of the basin, until at last they were walking beneath the foliage of a great forest. What wind there was at their back, and the ape-man, though he moved at a swinging walk, was constantly on the alert. Upon the hard-packed earth of the trail there were few signs to indicate the nature of the animals that had passed to and fro, but here and there the spoor of a lion was in evidence. Several times Tarzan stopped and listened. Often he raised his head, and his sensitive nostrils dilated as he sought for whatever the surrounding air might hold for him. "I think there are men in this valley," he said presently. "For some time I have been almost positive that we are being watched, but whoever is stalking us is clever beyond words, for it is only the barest suggestion of another presence that I can scent." La looked about apprehensively and drew close to his side. "I see no one," she said in a low voice. "Nor I," he replied. "Nor can I catch any well-defined scent spoor, yet I am positive that someone is following us, someone or something that trails by scent, and is clever enough to keep its scent from us. It is more than likely that, whatever it is passing through the trees, at a sufficient height to keep its scent spoor always above us. The air is right for that, and even if he were upwind from us we might not catch his scent at all. Wait here, I will make sure." And he swung lightly into the branches of a nearby tree and swarmed upward with the agility of Manu the monkey. A moment later he descended to the girl's side. "I was right," he said. "There is someone or something not far off, but whether it is man or Mangani I cannot say, for the odor is a strange one to me, suggesting neither yet both. But two can play at that game. Come." And he swung the girl to his shoulder, and a moment later had carried her high into the trees. "Unless he is close enough to watch us, which I doubt," he said, "our spoor will be carried over his head, and it will be some time before he can pick it up again, unless he is wise enough to rise to a higher level." La marveled at the strength of the ape-man as he carried her easily from tree to tree, and at the speed with which he traversed the swaying, leafy trail. For half an hour he continued onward, and then quite suddenly he stopped, poised high upon a swaying bough. "Look," he said, pointing ahead and below them. Looking in the direction that he indicated, the girl saw through the leafy foliage a small, heavily stockaded compound, in which were some dozen huts that immediately riveted her surprised attention, nor no less was the ape-man's curiosity piqued by what he glimpsed vaguely through the foliage. Huts they evidently were, but they seemed to be moving to and fro in the air, some moving gently backward and forward, while others jumped up and down in more or less violent agitation. Tarzan swung to a nearer tree and descended to a sturdy branch, to which he lowered La from his shoulder. Then he crept forward stealthily, the girl following, for she was, in common with the other Oparians, slightly arboreal. Presently they reached a point where they could see plainly the village below them, and immediately the seeming mystery of the dancing huts was explained. They were of the beehive type common to many African tribes, and were about 7 feet in diameter by 6 or 7 in height, but instead of resting on the ground, each hut was suspended by a heavy hawser-like grass rope to a branch of one of the several giant trees that grew within the stockade. From the center of the bottom of each hut trailed another lighter rope. From his position above them, Tarzan saw no openings in any of the huts large enough to admit the body of a man, though there were several openings 4 or 5 inches in diameter in the sides of each hut, about 3 feet above the floor. Upon the ground inside the compound were several of the inhabitants of the village, if the little collection of swinging houses could be dignified by such a name, nor were the people any less strange to Tarzan than their peculiar domiciles. That they were Negroes was evident, but of a type entirely unfamiliar to the ape-man. All were naked, and without any ornamentation whatsoever other than a few daubs of color, placed apparently at random upon their bodies. They were tall and very muscular appearing, though their legs seemed much too short and their arms too long for perfect symmetry, while their faces were almost bestial in contour, their jaws being exaggeratedly prognathous, while above their beetling brows there was no forehead, the skull running back in an almost horizontal plane to a point. As Tarzan stood looking at them, he saw another descend one of the ropes that dangled from the bottom of a hut, and immediately he understood the purpose of the ropes and the location of the entrances to the dwellings. The creatures squatting about upon their haunches were engaged in feeding. Several had bones from which they were tearing the uncooked flesh with their great teeth, while others ate fruit and tubers. There were individuals of both sexes and of various ages from childhood to maturity, but there was none that seemed very old. They were practically hairless, except for scraggy, reddish-brown locks upon their heads. They spoke but seldom, and then in tones which resembled the growling of beasts, nor once, while Tarzan watched them, did he see one laugh or even smile, which of all their traits rendered them most unlike the average native of Africa. Though Tarzan's eyes searched the compound carefully, he saw no indication of cooking utensils or of any fire. Upon the ground about them lay their weapons, short javelin-like spears and a sort of battle-axe with a sharpened metal blade. Tarzan of the Apes was glad that he had come this way, for it had permitted him to see such a type of native as he had not dreamed existed, a type so low that it bordered closely upon the brute. Even the Wazdons and Hodons of Palul-Don were far advanced in the scale of evolution compared to these. As he looked at them, he could not but wonder that they were sufficiently intelligent to manufacture the weapons they possessed, which he could see, even at a distance, were of fine workmanship and design. Their huts, too, seemed well and ingeniously made, while the stockade which surrounded the little compound was tall, strong, and well built, evidently for the purpose of safeguarding them against the lions which infested the basin. As Tarzan and La watched these people, they became presently aware of the approach of some creature from their left, and a moment later they saw a man similar to those of the compound swing from a tree that overhung the stockade and drop within. The others acknowledged his coming with scarce more than indifferent glances. He came forward and, squatting among them, appeared to be telling them of something, and though Tarzan could not hear his words, he judged from his gestures and the sign language which he used to supplement his meager speech, that he was telling his fellows of the strange creatures he had seen in the forest a short time before, and the ape-man immediately judged that this was the same whom he had been aware was following them and whom he had successfully put off the scent. The narration evidently excited them, for some of them arose and, leaping up and down with bent knees, slapped their arms against their sides grotesquely. The expressions upon their faces scarcely changed, however, and after a moment each squatted down again as he had been before. It was while they were thus engaged that there echoed through the forest a loud scream that awakened in the mind of the ape-man many savage memories. "Bolgani," he whispered to L.A. "It is one of the great apes," she said, and shuddered. Presently they saw him, swinging down the jungle trail toward the compound, a huge gorilla, but such a gorilla as Tarzan of the Apes had never looked on before. Of almost gigantic stature, the creature was walking erect with the stride of a man, not ever once touching his knuckles to the ground. His head and face were almost those of a gorilla, and yet there was a difference, as Tarzan could note as the creature came nearer. It was Bolgani, with the soul and brain of a man, nor was this all that rendered the creature startling and unique. Stranger, perhaps, than aught else was the fact that it wore ornaments, and such ornaments. Gold and diamonds sparkled against its shaggy coat. Above its elbows were numerous armlets, and there were anklets upon its legs, while from a girdle about its middle there depended before and behind a long narrow strip that almost touched the ground, and which seemed to be entirely constructed of golden spangles set with small diamonds. Never before had John Clayton, Lord Greystoke, seen such a display of barbaric finery, nor even amidst the jewels of Opar such a wealth of priceless stones. Immediately after the hideous scream had first broken the comparative silence of the forest, Tarzan had noticed its effects upon the inmates of the compound. Instantly they had arisen to their feet. The women and children scurried behind the boles of the trees or clambered up the ropes into their swinging cages, while some of the men advanced to what Tarzan now saw was the gate of the compound. Outside this gate the gorilla halted and again raised his voice, but this time in speech rather than his hideous scream. Upon the third day Tarzan shall die beneath my knife. Chapter 9. The Shaft of Death. As the huge man-like gorilla entered the compound, the warriors closed the gate and fell back respectfully as he advanced to the center of the village, where he stood for a moment, looking about. "Where are the shes and the balas?" he asked tersely. "Call them." The women and the children must have heard the command, but they did not emerge from their hiding places. The warriors moved about uneasily, evidently torn by the conflicting emotions of fear of the creature who had issued the order and reluctance to fulfill his commands. "Call them," he repeated, "or go and fetch them," but at last one of the warriors mustered the courage to address him. "This village has already furnished one woman within the moon," he said. "It is the turn of another village." "Silence," roared the gorilla man, advancing threateningly toward him. "You are a rash Gomangani to threaten the will of a Bolgani. I speak with the voice of Numa, the emperor. Obey or die." Trembling, the black turned and called the women and children, but none responded to his summons. The Bolgani gestured impatiently. "Go and fetch them," he demanded, and the blacks, cringing, moved sullenly across the compound toward the hiding places of their women and children. Presently they returned, dragging them with them by the arms sometimes, but usually by the hair. Although they had seemed loath to give them up, they showed no gentleness toward them, nor any indication of affection. Their attitude toward them, however, was presently explained to Tarzan by the next words of the warrior who had spoken previously. "Great Bolgani," he said, addressing the gorilla man, "if Numa takes always from this village, there will soon be not enough women for the warriors here, and there will be too few children, and in a little time there will be none of us left." "What of that?" growled the gorilla man. "There are already too many Gomangani in the world. For what other purpose were you created than to serve Numa, the emperor, and his chosen people, the Bolgani?" As he spoke, he was examining the women and children, pinching their flesh and pounding upon their chests and backs. Presently he returned to a comparatively young woman, straddling whose hip was a small child. "This one will do," he said, snatching the child from its mother and hurling it roughly across the compound, where it lay against the face of the palisade, moaning pitifully and perchance broken and dying. The poor, stupid mother, apparently more beast than human, stood for a moment trembling in dumb anguish, and then she started to rush forward to her child. But the gorilla man seized her with one of his great hands and hurled her to the ground. Simultaneously there arose from the silent foliage above them the fierce and terrible scream of the challenging bull ape. In terror the simple blacks cast affrighted glances upward, while the gorilla man raised his hideous face in snarling anger toward the author of the bestial cry. Swaying upon a leafy bough they beheld such a creature as none of them had ever looked upon before, a white man, a Tarmangani, with hide as hairless as the body of Hista, the snake. In the instant that they looked, they saw the spear hand of the stranger drive forward, and the shaft, speeding with the swiftness of thought, bury itself in the breast of the Bolgani. With a single scream of rage and pain, the gorilla man crumbled to the earth, where he struggled spasmodically for a moment, and then lay still, in death. The ape-man held no great love for the Gomangani as a race, but inherent in his English brain and heart was the spirit of fair play, which prompted him to spontaneous espousal of the cause of the weak. On the other hand, Bolgani was his hereditary enemy. His first battle had been with Bolgani and his first kill. The poor blacks were still standing in stupefied wonderment when he dropped from the tree to the ground among them. They stepped back in terror, and simultaneously they raised their spears menacingly against him. "I am a friend," he said. "I am Tarzan of the apes. Lower your spears." And then he turned and withdrew his own weapon from the carcass of Bolgani. "Who is this creature that may come into your village and slay your balas and steal your shes? Who is he that you dare not drive your spears through him?" "He is one of the great Bolgani," said the warrior who seemed to be spokesman and the leader in the village. "He is one of the chosen people of Numa, the emperor, and when Numa learns that he has been killed in our village, we shall all die for what you have done." "Who is Numa?" demanded the ape-man, to whom Numa in the language of the great apes meant only lion. "Numa is the emperor," replied the black, "who lives with the Bolgani in the Palace of Diamonds." He did not express himself in just these words, for the meager language of the great apes, even though, amplified by the higher intelligence and greater development of the Oparians, is still primitive in the extreme. What he had really said was more nearly Numa, the king of kings, who lives in the king's hut of glittering stones, which carried to the ape-man's mind the faithful impression of the fact. Numa, evidently, was the name adopted by the king of the Bolgani, and the title emperor indicated merely his preeminence among the chiefs. The instant that Bolgani had fallen, the bereaved mother rushed forward and gathered her injured infant into her arms. She squatted now against the palisade, cuddling it to her breast, and crooning softly to pacify its cries, which Tarzan suddenly discovered were more the result of fright than injury. At first the mother had been frightened when he had attempted to examine the child, drawing away and baring her fighting fangs, much after the manner of a wild beast. But presently there had seemed to come to her dull brain a realization that this creature had saved her from Bolgani, that he had permitted her to recover her infant, and that he was making no effort to harm either of them. Convinced at last that the child was only bruised, Tarzan turned again toward the warriors, who were talking together in an excited little group a few paces away. As they saw him advancing, they spread into a semicircle and stood facing him. "The Bolgani will send and slay us all," they said, "when they learn what has happened in our village, unless we can take to them the creature that cast the spear. Therefore, Tarmangani, you shall go with us to the Palace of Diamonds, and there we shall give you over to the Bolgani, and perhaps Numa will forgive us." The ape-man smiled. What kind of creature did the simple blacks think him, to believe that he would permit himself to be easily led into the avenging hands of Numa, the emperor of the Bolgani? Although he was fully aware of the risk that he had taken in entering the village, he knew too that because he was Tarzan of the apes, there was a greater chance that he would be able to escape than that they could hold him. He had faced savage spearmen before and knew precisely what to expect in the event of hostilities. He preferred, however, to make peace with these people, for it had been in his mind to find some means of questioning them the moment that he had discovered their village hidden away in this wild forest. "Wait," he said, "therefore, would you betray a friend who enters your village to protect you from an enemy? We will not slay you, Tarmangani. We will take you to the Bolgani for Numa, the emperor." "But that would amount to the same thing," returned Tarzan, "for you well know that Numa, the emperor, will have me slain." "That we cannot help," replied the spokesman. "If we could save you, we would, but when the Bolgani discover what has happened in our village, it is we who must suffer, unless, perhaps, they are satisfied to punish you instead." "But why need they know that the Bolgani has been slain in your village?" asked Tarzan. "Will they not see his body next time they come?" asked the spokesman. "Not if you remove his body," replied Tarzan. The blacks scratched their heads. Into their dull, ignorant minds had crept no such suggestion of a solution of their problem. What the stranger said was true. None but they, and he knew that Bolgani had been slain within their palisade. To remove the body, then, would be to remove all suspicion from their village. But where were they to take it? They put the question to Tarzan. "I will dispose of him for you," replied the Tarmangani. "Answer my questions truthfully, and I will promise to take him away and dispose of him in such a manner that no one will know how he died or where." "What are your questions?" asked the spokesman. "I am a stranger in your country. I am lost here," replied the ape-man, "and I would find a way out of the valley in that direction," and he pointed toward the southeast. The black shook his head. "There may be a way out of the valley in that direction," he said, "but what lies beyond no man knows, nor do I know whether there be a way out or whether there be anything beyond. It is said that all is fire beyond the mountain, and no one dares to go and see. As for myself, I have never been far from my village, at most only a day's march, to hunt for game for the Bolgani and to gather fruit and nuts and plantains for them. If there is a way out, I do not know, nor would any man dare take it if there were." "Does no one ever leave the valley?" asked Tarzan. "I know not what others do," replied the spokesman, "but those of this village never leave the valley." "What lies in that direction?" asked Tarzan, pointing toward Opar. "I do not know," replied the black, "only that sometimes the Bolgani come from that way, bringing with them strange creatures, little men with white skins and much hair, with short, crooked legs and long arms, and sometimes white shiz, who do not look at all like the strange little Tarmangani. But where they get them I do not know, nor do they ever tell us. Are these all the questions that you wish to ask?" "Yes, that is all," replied Tarzan, seeing that he could gain no information whatsoever from these ignorant villagers. Realizing that he must find his own way out of the valley, and knowing that he could do so much more quickly and safely if he was alone, he decided to sound the blacks in relation to a plan that had entered his mind. "If I take the Bolgani away so that the others will not know that he was slain in your village, will you treat me as a friend?" he asked. "Yes," replied the spokesman. "Then," said Tarzan, "will you keep here for me my white she until I return again to your village? You can hide her in one of your huts if a Bolgani comes, and no one need ever know that she is among you. What do you say?" The blacks looked around. "We do not see her," said the spokesman. "Where is she?" "If you will promise to protect her and hide her, I will bring her here," replied the ape-man. "I will not harm her," said the headman, "but I do not know about the others." Tarzan turned toward the others who were clustered about, listening. "I am going to bring my mate into your village," he said, "and you are going to hide her, and feed her, and protect her until I return. I shall take away the body of Bolgani, so that no suspicion shall fall upon you, and when I come back I shall expect to find my mate safe and unharmed." He had thought it best to describe La as his mate, since thus they might understand that she was under his protection, and if they felt either gratitude or fear toward him, La would be safer. Raising his face toward the tree where she was hidden, he called to La to descend, and a moment later she clambered down to the lower branches of one of the trees in the compound and dropped into Tarzan's arms. "This is she," he said to the assembled blacks. "Guard her well and hide her from the Bolgani. If upon my return I find that any harm has befallen her, I shall take word to the Bolgani that it was you who did this," and he pointed to the corpse of the gorilla man. La turned appealingly toward him, fear showing in her eyes. "You are not going to leave me here?" she asked. "Temporarily only," replied Tarzan. "These poor people are afraid that if the death of this creature is traced to their village, they shall all suffer the wrath of his fellows. And so I have promised that I will remove the evidence in such a way as to direct suspicion elsewhere, if they are sufficiently high in the scale of evolution to harbor sentiments of gratitude, which I doubt. They will feel obligated to me for having slain this beast, as well as for preventing suspicion falling upon them. For these reasons they should protect you, but to make assurance doubly sure I have appealed also to their fear of the Bolgani, a characteristic which I know they possess. I am sure that you will be as safe here as with me until I return, otherwise I would not leave you. But alone I can travel much faster, and while I am gone I intend to find a way out of this valley. Then I shall return for you, and together we may make our escape easily, or at least with greater assurance of success than were we to blunder slowly about together." "You will come back?" she asked, a note of fear, longing, and appeal in her voice. "I will come back," he replied, and then turning to the blacks, "Clear out one of these huts for my mate and see that she is not molested, and that she is furnished with food and water, and remember what I said, upon her safety your lives depend." Stooping, Tarzan lifted the dead gorilla man to his shoulder, and the simple blacks marveled at his prowess, and of great physical strength themselves. There was not one of them but would have staggered under the weight of Bolgani, yet this strange Tarmangani walked easily beneath his burden. And when they had opened the gate in the palisade, he trotted down the jungle trail as though he carried nothing but his own frame. A moment later he disappeared at a turn and was swallowed by the forest. La turned to the blacks. "Prepare my hut," she said, for she was very tired and longed to rest. They eyed her askance and whispered among themselves. It was evident to her that there was a difference of opinion among them, and presently from snatches of conversation which she overheard she realized that while some of the blacks were in favor of obeying Tarzan's injunctions implicitly, there were others who objected strenuously and who wished to rid their village of her, lest she be discovered there by the Bolgani, and the villagers be punished accordingly. "It would be better," she heard one of the blacks say, "to turn her over to the Bolgani at once and tell them that we saw her mate slay the messenger of Numa. We will say that we tried to capture the Tarmangani but that he escaped, and that we were only able to seize his mate. Thus will we win the favor of Numa. And perhaps then he will not take so many of our women and children." "But the Tarmangani is great," replied one of the others. "He is more powerful even than Bolgani. He would make a terrible enemy, and as the chances are that the Bolgani would not believe us, we should then have not only them but the Tarmangani to fear." "You are right," cried La. "The Tarmangani is great. Far better will it be for you to have him for friend than enemy. Single-handed he grapples with Numa the lion and slays him. You saw with what ease he lifted the body of the mighty Bolgani to his shoulder. You saw him trot lightly down the jungle trail beneath his burden. With equal ease will he carry the corpse through the trees of the forest. far above the ground. In all the world there is no other like him, no other like Tarzan of the apes. If you are wise, Gomangani, you will have Tarzan for a friend. The blacks listened to her, their dull faces revealing nothing of what was passing in their stupid brains. For a few moments they stood thus in silence, the hulking, ignorant blacks upon one side, the slender, beautiful white woman upon the other. Then Louisiana spoke. "Go," she cried imperiously, "and prepare my hut." It was the high priestess of the flaming god Lea, the queen of Opar, addressing slaves. Her regal mien, her commanding tones wrought an instant change in the villagers, and La knew then that Tarzan was right in his assumption that they could be moved only through fear, for now they turned quickly, cowering like whipped dogs, and hastened to a nearby hut, which they quickly prepared for her, fetching fresh leaves and grasses for its floor, and fruit and nuts and plantains for her meal. When all was ready, La clambered up the rope and through the circular opening in the floor of the hanging hut, which she found large and airy, and now reasonably clean. She drew the rope up after her and threw herself upon the soft bed they had prepared for her, and soon the gentle swaying of the swinging hut, the soft murmur of the leaves above her, the voices of the birds and insects combined with her own physical exhaustion to lull her into deep slumber.